I'd like to welcome you to our podcast. Today we're studying through the book of 1 Corinthians, and we're in 1 Corinthians, the 14th chapter, starting with verse number 13. Now, the Apostle Paul is writing to the Corinthian church because the Corinthian church was basically just a big mess, and they were doing all sorts of things. And so the Apostle Paul is writing to give them instruction on how to have a church service that's in order. Now, some people have completely ruled out the supernatural. They've completely ruled out the gifts of the Spirit and things like that, and they say that's in order. Well, you know what? That is just as much out of order as people who go hog wild, so to speak, over the gifts, and they speak in tongues all the time and all of this stuff. You know what? The balance is that you need both. You need the supernatural giftings of the Holy Spirit, but those giftings need to stay in an orderly fashion. So please don't throw out the gifts. Don't say, I don't want anything to do with those gifts. Just because you've seen people abuse them, or maybe you've abused them even yourself, make sure that you stay the middle of the road. You know, every road that I know of has got two ditches. It's got one ditch on one side, the other ditch on the other side. The key is to keep your car between the ditches. I used to drive truck before I went into Bible college, and one of the things that we would say over the CB is keep it between the ditches. You know what? We need to make sure that we maintain our church order between the two ditches, and one of those ditches is to rule out the supernatural. The other ditch is to have an overabundance or a complete reliance on the supernatural. And so that's what Paul is talking about. And let's get into our study. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 13 says, Therefore, let everyone who speaks in tongues pray that he may interpret. Now, what's the Apostle Paul talking about? He's talking about a person who's speaking in an unknown language. He's speaking and he's using the gift of the Holy Spirit, and he's speaking out. Now, what does he need to do? He's speaking out in public. Now, we've talked already about how tongues is used in private to edify themselves, but tongues in public, in a public display, always need to be interpreted. So the Apostle Paul writes here, and he says, if you speak in tongues, pray that there is an interpretation in tongues. And again, he's talking about the gift of tongues, and he's talking about it in a public meeting, and you need to pray that you interpret. Pray that there's an interpretation of tongues. Elsewhere, the Apostle Paul says, if you speak in tongues, make sure that there's an interpreter or the gift of interpretation there in the service. So we understand that the Apostle Paul now is addressing tongues as the gift of the Holy Spirit, not the praying in tongues, not the use or the natural ability God gives to people to speak in other languages. He's talking about the gift of speaking in tongues, and if you speak in tongues, you need to interpret. Now, verse number 14. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays and my mind is unfruitful. Now, what's the key word here? The key word here is pray. Now the Apostle Paul is moving back and he's saying there is a prayer language of tongues. And what does he say about this prayer language of tongues? He says, if I pray in tongues, my spirit prays. Do you understand that twice in this very short verse, in verse number 14, twice the Apostle Paul uses this word praise? What is Paul talking about? He is praying in an unknown language. He is praying in a tongue. Now notice the word tongue is in the singular. I believe that there is a language that God gives us that we can speak to God directly. It's a heavenly language. It's a language that only God understands. And it's a powerful, powerful thing for the believer. Now, for if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays. What's generating this? The Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is generating this tongue or this prayer language that goes directly to God. If I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. What goes on in your mind when you're praying in tongues? Your mind doesn't understand anything. In fact, one of the reasons why many believers don't pray in other tongues is because they're so dependent upon their mind. They have to think everything through. They have to reason everything out before they will allow their spirits to express themselves to God. But your mind is going to be unfruitful when you pray in that tongue, when you pray in that heavenly language. Your mind's not going to understand. That's what the Apostle Paul is getting at. Now, very quickly, moving on to verse number 15. What is the outcome then? I will pray with the Spirit. Notice the word pray again. And I will pray with the mind also. What's Paul saying? He's saying you need to pray in the Spirit, in other words, in a spirit language, but you also need to pray with your mind. You need to speak things. You need to confess things. You need to ask God with your mind. And so he says, what's the outcome then? In other words, how does this need to look like, or what does this need to look like? I need to pray in the Spirit, but I also need to pray with my mind. I will sing in the Spirit, and I will sing with my mind also. Notice, there's a thing that we can do as believers is we can sing in a heavenly language. I believe it's the most perfect form of worship towards God. We can sing in a heavenly language. Now, we don't hear it very often anymore, and I wish that we would. But we in private can sing in a heavenly language. Sing in the Spirit. But then he says, and I will sing with my mind also. In other words, I will use my mind to sing. I will use my mind to sing hymns. I will use my mind to sing praises. I will use my mind to worship the Lord. You see, it's very important that we as believers receive the instruction that the Apostle Paul is giving to the church, because it is so important that we have in our lives the spiritual realm of praying in the Spirit, singing in the Spirit, praying to God in a language that no one, including our minds, understands, but also on the other side that we're doing it with our minds also. It's very, very important. It's vital to our Christian life. Thank you for watching us today. Join us again tomorrow as we pick up in verse number 16 of the 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians.